In defending ourselves against American hegemonism, we are nevertheless fighting not only against someone, but for something. It's something called the wonderful new world of the future. It is assumed that it will be multipolar and polycentric, that the Russian world will peacefully neighbor and coexist in it with other national worlds. In general, there will be universal grace and the tigers will play peacefully with the Segnets. Simply put, it's nice to dream, but it's incredibly difficult to organize such a world. Recently Putin, explaining why Russia perpetually looks so lonely on the world stage, said that it has many allies, but they behave more quietly. Russian society often lodges complaints against such quiet allies for their reticence. It's bad, of course, when your ally is afraid to say a word in your defense, hides behind the backs of others and silently waits to see whose will take it. But that's not the worst thing that awaits us in the beautiful new world of the future, a post-American world, a world without US hegemony. Once the winner is decided, our allies will talk right away, but American allies won't be animated either. Former US allies will start looking for a new military and political umbrella, some in the person of Russia and some in the person of China. What in the 19th century was called a concert of powers, what in the second half of the 20th century looked like a coherent duet of the United States and the Soviet Union, will turn into a hellish cacophony of big and small ambitions and constant demands of small countries to the leaders of the multipolar world, to resolve disputes with neighbors in their favor, to protect and secure their territorial, political and economic interests. Small countries within any world behave like exuberant vassals who consider the king as the first among equals, obliged to look after their exclusive interests every second. Or, as described in bylinas and sagas, chronicles and annals, the druzhiny of Slavic princes, Germanic dukes, Scandinavian jarls and konings. They certainly don't mind fighting for the prince, especially if the war is with street booty, but their main business is to pepper his chambers, to boast of the wonders of their own bravery, to receive from the prince as a gift beautiful clothes, cups, weapons, horses, jewelry, and to demand that he distinguish and exalt them in comparison with other warriors. Wrong seat? It's from there. All in all, there is far less benefit from the hegemon's high-profile allies than there are problems to solve. That's the way it's always been. Recall, for example, the conflict of the Soviet Union's allies with Somalia and Ethiopia, which is still ongoing. Despite the fact that all three have already disintegrated, including the Soviet Union, the former arbiter of this dispute, the countries and territories of all three former fellow citizens fight each other fiercely. It will always be so. It is a property of human nature, immanent both to an individual person. I have not accidentally cited the example of ancient vigilantes, and to a large collective up to states. The US solved this problem simply by generalized suppression. It was no coincidence that America demanded unconditional obedience from all its allies, regardless of whether the decision made in Washington was in their interests. Americans have elevated the principles of collectivism and democratic centralism to absolutes. They have always motivated the suppression of dissenters by the interests of the collective, NATO or the collective West. And they justified their right to decide for everyone by the fact that it is they who possess most of the aggregate economic, political and military power of the West, and it is they who provide military protection of its collective interests, and therefore know better what the whole collective needs. Since, however, most of their allies accepted American initiatives without reservation, the troublemaker could always be pointed out that he alone was splintering the built-in ranks of the free world. Also, for example, if we take Kissinger, who strived, without going beyond the main trend of American politics, to be more diplomatic, to try to initially persuade and convince, was always closer to me than the aggressive Brzezinski, who initially staked on suppressing and forcing. For several decades so far the US, and with its pitch the so-called entire civilized world, including many fellow citizens have claimed that the American resource is inexhaustible and therefore there is no limit to American dominance. I have noted that history testifies to the exhaustibility of any resource, all the more so for our time, when all processes have reached the planetary level, and therefore have accelerated enormously. If earlier, having exhausted the resource of one region, you could theoretically replace it with the resource of another, you only had to conquer this other one. Now you are quickly bumping up against the limit of the planet's capabilities, and the conquest of space, at least near space, on an industrial scale is still very far away. The moment you reach the resource limit, you inevitably enter the era of crisis, which will also inevitably destroy you if you do not replace the resource-consuming policy with a resource-saving one. In fact, all of Putin's success in Russia in the last 2 decades is based on the fact that Russia, which was defeated in the Cold War, lost its peripheral territories and half of its population, and barely survived the systemic crisis of the 1990s, was not able to compete with the United States on an equal footing for a long time and was forced to adopt a resource-saving policy. The danger of the current state of affairs is that the Americans are actively and not without success trying to move us into a resource-consuming policy mode. It won't save the US, their policies are so costly that we won't have time to seriously lose weight before they collapse. But this trap for the near future has the potential to destroy the new Russia in the post-American world no less effectively than the United States was destroyed. The experience of victories arouses faith in one's own strength and the desire not to be ceremonious with opponents, but simply to take them and force them to follow the policy predetermined by Moscow. First of all, such euphoria overwhelms society. We can already observe a public demand to suppress indiscriminately any opposition, not only domestic but also foreign policy. Contrary to the belief of conspiracy theorists, politicians are very dependent on public sentiment, and the media, if their throats are not squeezed by the iron hand of political censorship, making them ineffective but harmless, tends to always be in the trend, because indulging the crowd's stupidity, including political, brings in hits, likes, advertising budgets, and government grants. Therefore, if the country fails to find a sufficiently adequate, consistent and authoritative politician capable of curbing public initiatives, then either the authorities accept the public demand and begin to realize it to an increasing extent, or the society chooses a new authority represented by more radical politicians. Very often Emperor Anastasius, who accumulated the treasury, is inherited immediately or after a short period of time Justinian, who, under the hand-wringing of the crowd, will squander this treasury on supposedly great construction projects and giant foreign policy adventures, leaving a systemic crisis for his descendants. Russia's position after defeating the US will be complicated by the fact that it is unlikely to be the only hegemon. Already now there are 4 to 5 future centers of power, including Russia and China, which will be maneuvered between by the silent, but by then extremely shouty majority of allies, choosing the best conditions for themselves, and at the same time unwittingly, and sometimes deliberately, spoiling the superpowers. After all, by not standing up for an ally, you lose some of your international credibility. It is this trap, which pushes the post-American world into a new struggle for hegemony, and hegemons to use methods of power domination, that is the most dangerous, because it is very attractive to be like everyone else and stomp your feet over any disagreement with your policies. This is a trap that Russia should avoid at all costs by remaining committed to resource-saving policies. In the end, it was Kissinger's diplomacy that led to bringing China to the American side, which finally undermined the Soviet Union's capabilities, forcing it to confront a strong opponent in the West and East at the same time. It's like if Japan had started the war in 1941 without allowing Siberian divisions to be moved near Moscow. But Brzezinski's method of force exhausted the United States, eventually giving Russia one southern country, albeit in the form of smoking ruins, which Brzezinski himself rightly saw as the key to containing Russia and blocking its policy in the European direction. Experience is the ability not to repeat the mistakes of the enemy, especially if those mistakes have been repeated many times in human history from Ossyria to the present day and have always led to the same negative result.